I did want to take a minute this morning while we had some time to speak about a bill that I intend to introduce later this week with my co-chair and ranking member of our new subcommittee on disaster response, Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska, and other members of my subcommittee as we begin to lay down pieces of legislation that are apparent and necessary to improve the general disaster response for this country, which has been found to be severely lacking. The bill that I will introduce later this week is called the First Responders Broadcasters Act. It is a piece of legislation, as I said, that I'll be filing with other members of my subcommittee. Mr. President, as my state continues to rebuild out of the rubble and destruction and devastation of the first and third worst natural disaster to hit the country and the subsequent levee breaks that filled up a major American city within 24 hours and continues to wreak havoc on those struggling to get home and rebuild their lives, we learned one of the most vital lessons was that information, good information, accurate information, was not only vital, but it was essential as the first building block to our recovery. In providing it, all of our local media, broadcasters particularly, and their websites and newspapers did an amazing job to keep the people of Louisiana and our region and the Gulf Coast and frankly the nation and actually the world community that was aghast at what was happening in South Louisiana and the New Orleans region for Katrina, but also the Southwest region for Rita 4 weeks later. With phone lines down, cell phones out, and streets too flooded to move around to get any kind of perspective about what was actually happening and where the 4 to 20 feet of water was coming from when we had never seen anything like that in the history of our city. The sound of local radio or television stations was what hundreds of thousands of my constituents relied on. It was the only voice for those in the first darkest days and nights, and continued for weeks and months, and actually, Mr. President, continues to this day because of the credibility of our local broadcasters. At a time when the public needed them, they were there. Our local broadcasters provided this life-saving information, and as you will recall, we have lost over 1,000 lives in Louisiana and over 200 lives in Mississippi. But many lives, I'm convinced, were saved because of broadcasters having lost their own stations, their own equipment, their own homes, and with their own loved ones missing, stayed on the job. And more importantly, stayed on the air so that the reporters could report what was happening, and even those of us in powerful positions could get a better handle on the situation. As local radio and television stations stand up, as so many did, and put commercial interest aside to serve the public interest, the federal government, in my opinion, should be ready to stand up with them. And that's what this bill is about. It's not a long bill, it's not a complicated bill, and it really doesn't cost very much money. But it will have major impacts as this nation tries to fashion better responses for our country. And we are in desperate need of new tools, new toolboxes, and this is one of them. In fact, for more than 50 years, we have required local broadcasters to be at the front line of sounding the alarm in a disaster. With the entire industry dependent on public airwaves, broadcasters have a duty to serve the public in times of crisis. That's what so many of them did. This is why stations today are required by law to be part of the emergency alert system. At the system's core are 34 primary entry points, radio stations with direct lines from emergency command centers in Washington and in their state. But half of our states don't even have these entry points. To receive an alert in Mississippi, for example, you needed to rely on the message being passed on from station to station from Louisiana. This bill, one of the several things it does, is add primary entry points to every underserved state and region to make sure that every state has an equal chance to be well prepared when disaster strikes and to try to put their best assets forward. I've said many times that all the assets in the world, all the plans in the world are not worth the paper they are written on or the text found on the internet, on the website, if you can't communicate them at the appropriate time to the appropriate people in the appropriate order. But what good is a successful emergency information chain if the last link fails? By technical necessity, this last link is right in the disaster's path. Simply put, transmitter needs to be in the same area as the people in need of warning. And I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes, Mr. President, and submit the rest of my remarks to the record. Despite our federal investments in emergency systems and entry point stations, there were several Gulf Coast broadcasters after the hurricanes that could not stay on the air simply because the government, our government, took their fuel away. Now let me repeat this. The stations struggling to stay on the air to tell first responders actually what was happening, to try to get their satellites up, their electricity up. So when people in Washington kept asking, what's going on, we could give them some answers. The fuel was confiscated because some low-level FEMA person decided they had higher priorities. When this bill is passed, they will be on the list as first responders, and their food, water, and fuel will not be allowed to be taken away, so that the public can get the information that they are desperate for in as independent and as accurate a way as possible. It also creates a matching grant program. It also helps to bring broadcast engineers back into the disaster zone more quickly to restore transmitters and other key facilities. Mr. President, no disaster warning, evacuation plan, or emergency instruction matters if it can't get to the people who need to hear it. And that is basically why this bill is so important. And finally, it's very important for the journalists who depend on the broadcasters for all of this equipment and technology to do their job, which is to try to report a story in as accurate a fashion as they can to the public that needs to respond, as well as to the first responders themselves and to government leaders. For journalists working to tell the story, newspapers and websites included, the bill makes sure that the local officials who know the local reporters best decide where the journalist can go and who can go and how long they can stay. Again, there will be no longer a contract, part-time FEMA official directing the news media or the broadcasters. The law will govern their basic rights, put them on the right list, make it clear that they themselves are first responders, and in this senator's view, extremely important first responders. I will submit my full record, my full statement to the record this afternoon when I file this bill. Again, I'm extremely pleased to have Senator Stevens join me. This is a bipartisan bill, not complicated, rather simple, but critical as we begin to stand up a better disaster response that this country is most certainly worthy of. And the people of Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Florida that are still suffering, and other parts of the country that suffer from disasters that in just a split second, just a few minutes at times, sometimes just in a few hours, dash the hopes and dreams of millions of Americans. We can't prevent tornadoes. We most certainly can't prevent hurricanes. And we can't prevent earthquakes. We can do a better job of predicting them. But the most important thing we can do is helping people to deal with these terrible tragedies that come their way. And in this senator's view, we have a lot of work to do.